Today we'll be working in my workbook called Paul from Preacher to Prisoner, and this will be on Acts 18, verse 23 to Acts 23, verse 24. Looking at the table of contents, we have completed the first 7 chapters. We've followed him on his third missionary journey. And then in the 7th chapter, he has arrived in Jerusalem, and the apostles there have told him to take a Nazirite vow to kind of protect him from the opposition that is in Jerusalem about Paul, because Paul has been preaching to the Gentiles and all these things. And so the Jews are not very happy with him. The Christians are fine, but the Jews are not that happy. So now we get into chapter 8, the result of that. Chapter 8, Paul is arrested, Acts 21, verses 27 through 39.
When the 7 days were nearly over, some Jews from the province of Asia saw Paul at the temple. They stirred up the whole crowd and seized him, shouting, "Fellow Israelites, help us. This is the man who teaches everyone everywhere against our people and our law in this place. And besides, he has brought Greeks into the temple and defiled this holy place." They had previously seen
Trophimus,
the Ephesian in the city with Paul, and assumed that Paul had brought him into the temple.
Were the 7 days of purification over?
Nearly over.
Nearly over, but not over yet. Why were the Jews from the province of Asia, where Ephesus is, in Jerusalem?
For the Pentecost.
Right. This reminds us of the riot in Ephesus. However, that was instigated by Gentiles. There were 4 reasons why these Jews stirred up the fellow Israelites. They are
teaches everyone everywhere against our people. Paul teaches against the temple. He teaches against the law and brought Greeks into the temple.
Right. The Jews that caused the commotion actually were incorrect in one of their accusations. What was it?
Paul didn't bring Greeks into the temple.
Right. No Gentiles were allowed in the temple. The punishment for that was stoning. And see page 47 to know more about Trophimus, because we talked about him before.
The whole city was aroused, and the people came running from all directions. Seizing Paul, they dragged him from the temple, and immediately the gates were shut.
Again, why were there so many Jews in Jerusalem at this time?
The Pentecost is celebrated.
Right. Seizing Paul, where did they drag him?
From the temple.
Right. Does it say anything about Trophimus, who's supposed to be with him in the temple?
No.
Does it say anything about the 4 men that were being purified with Paul?
No.
Does it say anything about any Christian coming to his rescue?
No.
Another sign that the Christian church in Jerusalem was not as strong as it should have been. What happened as soon as they got Paul outside of the temple?
They shut the gate.
This was to prevent both Paul running back into the temple for protection and to keep any violence out of the temple. God could have intervened and prevented Paul from going through this. Did he?
No.
So this is apparently was part of God's plan for Paul. Had Paul been forewarned both by the Holy Spirit and by Agabus that this would happen?
Yes.
Paul's life, in a sense, has come full circle. He was there when Stephen was stoned for his beliefs in Jesus Christ nearly 25 years prior, and now Paul is set to be stoned for the very same thing.
Thank goodness we're not stoned.
Yeah, it would hurt.
Yep. While they were trying to kill him, news reached the commander of the Roman troops that the whole city of Jerusalem was in an uproar. He at once took some officers and soldiers and ran down to the crowd. When the rioters saw the commander and his soldiers, they stopped beating Paul.
What about the commotion outside of the temple gates?
Sorry about that.
Number 1.
Oh, okay. Commander of the Roman troops heard about the commotion.
The commander would have been stationed in the Tower of Antonia, the northwest corner of the Temple Mount. This meant that more than 1,000 Roman soldiers were stationed only 2 flights of stairs from the court of the Gentiles. Extra soldiers would have been brought in for the festival as well. What did the mob stop doing to Paul when they saw the officers and soldiers?
Stop beating him.
The mob had seized Paul in the temple and then had moved him into the court of the Gentiles to beat him. This meant that they
Respected
the temple enough that they did not want to defile it with death. Therefore, the holiness of the temple was greater than their respect for the law, where man is brought before the Sanhedrin before being sentenced to death. However, the mob stopped beating Paul when the Roman soldiers and officers came because their concern over being put in jail
is greater than
their desire to beat Paul to death. So basically, you see a hierarchy here. They see the temple as the most important, but the Roman soldiers are even more important than their idea about the law. So, anyway, so who is this commander? Who is the commander shown in Acts 21 to 23? This commander's name is Claudius Lysias. Claudius was a commander of the Roman garrison in Jerusalem. He is in charge of 600 to 1,000 men. Although the exact numbers in his cohort may never have been known, he had sufficient men to spare 2 centurions, 200 soldiers, and 70 horsemen, and 200 spearmen to accompany Paul to Caesarea in Acts 23:23, and still have enough left to protect Jerusalem. Despite being a Roman soldier, Luke, the writer of the book of Acts, seems to present him as a fair and just man. Several times he will listen to Paul and intercede for Paul. A great description of him is written by www.jrtalks.com. He was prompt as he came immediately when there was trouble. He was brave as he came down personally when there was a riot. He was reasonable as he gives Paul permission to address the crowd. He was ruthless as he was quite prepared to have Paul flogged for confession. He was approachable as he listened when Paul wanted to talk with him. He was a wise when he will listen to Paul's nephew and act accordingly. Lastly, he was thorough when he made sure Paul arrived in Caesarea safely. So he was a very qualified man for his position.
The commander came up and arrested him and ordered him to be bound with 2 chains. Then he asked who he was and what he had done. Some in the crowd shouted one thing and some another. And since the commander could not get at the truth because of the uproar, he ordered that Paul be taken into the barracks.
What did the commander do to Paul?
Arrested him.
And put him in chains, right?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, well, how many chains was Paul bound with?
2.
That would mean that 2 soldiers were chained to Paul on either hand. The commander asked the crowd 2 questions. What were they?
Who he was and what he had done.
Could the commander understand the accusations against Paul?
No.
Where did the commander have Paul taken to?
Barracks.
Barracks is where the soldiers reside. It's not the prison. Why did the commander take Paul into the barracks?
Because of the uproar.
Yeah, he couldn't tell what was going on. Now, looking at number 7 on page 89, how do you think God intervened?
Now, do you think God intervened? Yes.
Yeah. Yeah. He did intervene.
Okay. When Paul reached the steps, the violence of the mob was so great he had to be carried by the soldiers. The crowd that followed kept shouting, "Get rid of him!" As the soldiers were about to take Paul into the barracks, he asked the commander, "May I say something to you?" "Do you speak Greek?" he replied.
So why did Paul have to be carried into the barracks?
Because the violence of the mob.
What was the crowd shouting?
Get rid of him.
This doesn't mean remove him from the area. It means kill him. By his question, does it appear that Paul is scared, angry, or upset?
No.
What was Paul's question to the commander?
May I say something to you?
Paul must have asked it in Hebrew because what did the commander respond with?
Do you speak Greek?
Here we begin to see that of all the people that could be arrested, Paul is uniquely designed for this task by God. If we are ever in a very scary situation, especially due to our work for God, for Him, God may be using us because of our boldness or our conviction. Paul is a Jew born in the Greek city of Tarsus. His name is Saul, Greek, as well as Paul, Hebrew. He went to Jewish schools and he probably from a wealthy family. Do you think he speaks Greek?
Yes.
Yes, he did. He does.
Aren't you the Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness some time ago? Paul answered, I am a Jew from Taurus in Sicilia,
Tarsus, right?
a citizen of no ordinary city. Please let me speak to the people.
Who does the commander mistake Paul for?
Egyptian who started a revolt and led 4,000 terrorists out into the wilderness.
This Egyptian mention had led a ragged army of 4,000 men to the Mount of Olives, where they stated that they would take over the Temple Mount. The Roman soldiers had scattered them, but the leader had gotten away. How does Paul identify himself? Go ahead and fill those out.
I am a Jew and I am from Taurus in Sicilia.
Yeah, Tarsus and Sicilia. How does Paul describe Tarsus?
A citizen of no ordinary city.
Tarsus was known for its university, and some considered it more important of a center of learning than Athens or Alexandria. Tarsus was also a Roman colony and a free city like Philippi. Those born there were Roman citizens with all the rights of someone born in Rome proper. That included the right to a trial there before being chained, beaten, tortured, or executed. Again, we see the uniqueness of Paul in this situation. Of all the apostles, Paul is both Greek and Jew and is able to speak in Greek to the commander. Of all the disciples of Christ, he is from Tarsus, a city with Roman citizenship that gives him special rights. What does Paul want to do?
Let me speak to the people.
Right. Paul is forever a preacher, even if he's going to have opposition.
Yep.
Okay, so we get to the end of our chapter here. Number 3 across, what language did the commander speak?
Greek.
Number 4, the commander thought Paul was the
Egyptian
who started a revolt. Number 7, what Roman official heard about the uproar?
commander.
8, Jews from what province saw Paul in the temple?
Asia.
10, the commander would have been stationed in the tower of where?
Antonia.
11, what city is Paul from?
Taurus.
Tarsus, yeah. 1, when Paul reached the steps, the mob was so great he had to be
carried
by the soldiers. 2, who did the Jews think Paul had brought into the temple? Trophimus. Yeah. 5, Paul was taken by the commander to the
carried.
6, the commander's name was Claudius.
Lysias.
Right. 7, Paul was bound with 2
chains.
And 9, after dragging Paul out of the temple, they closed the temple
gate.
Right. Okay, so let me finish this here.